The wind did not just blow across the high plains of the Wyoming territory. It hunted. It stripped the warmth from the air and drove the snow into hard, stinging pellets that scoured the sagebrush down to the wood. Silas Thorne pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher around his ears, though it did little to stop the chill from finding the spaces between his scarf and his jaw. He was miles from the nearest hearth, riding the northern perimeter of his land, a stretch of country that felt less like a ranch and more like a test of endurance. The gray sky hung low, pressing down on the white hills like a heavy wool blanket soaked in river water. It was late afternoon, and the light was already failing, turning the drifts into blue shadows that looked like bruises on the earth. Silas was a man built of the same hard materials as the land. 40 years of life had weathered him, carving lines around his eyes and tightening the skin over his cheekbones. He rode with the easy, slump-shouldered posture of a man who had spent more hours in the saddle than on his own feet. His horse, a roan gelding named Buster, plodded forward with his head down, snorting clouds of steam that vanished instantly in the gale. They were checking for breaks in the drift fence. The storm 2 nights ago had been vicious, a howling thing that could snap a pine tree like a dry twig. If the wire was down, his small herd of Herefords might wander into the canyons and freeze before he could find them. He spotted the irregularity near the dry creek bed known as Dead Man's Cut. It was not a break in the fence. It was a disturbance in the snow. Silas reined the gelding in. He squinted against the biting wind. Wolves left tracks that circled and wove. Cattle plowed straight furrows. This was neither. It was a drag mark. Something heavy had pulled itself through the crust, leaving a smear of disturbed powder that the wind was already trying to erase. He nudged the horse forward, one hand resting instinctively on the stock of the Winchester in his scabbard. The silence of the range was absolute, save for the wind. No birds, no coyotes, just the emptiness. He followed the track down into the cut where the brush grew thick and twisted. The snow was deeper here, drifted high against the bank. Then he saw the color, a dull, lifeless blue that did not belong in nature. Silas swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching loudly. He tied the reins to a scrub oak and waded through the drift. The shape became clear as he approached. It was a person, curled tight into a ball, half buried in the snow. He dropped to one knee, brushing the powder away. It was a woman. She was wearing a man's heavy canvas coat that was 3 sizes too big for her, swallowing her small frame. Beneath it, he saw the hem of a torn dress, the fabric fine and impractical for this country, stiff with frost. Her head was bare, her hair a matted tangle of dark waves plastered to her skull by melted snow. Silas reached out and touched her neck. Her skin was terrifyingly cold, like marble left out in a cellar, but there was a faint, thready pulse beneath his fingertips. She's alive, he thought, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow, but barely. He shifted to scoop her up, and the moment his hands closed around her shoulders, she flinched. It was a violent, jerking motion, her body reacting even in its frozen stupor. A small, ragged sound tore from her throat, not quite a scream, but a whimper of pure animal terror. She shrank away from his shadow as if she expected him to strike her. "Easy," Silas said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I am not going to hurt you." She did not answer. Her eyes remained closed, her face gray and slack. He saw the purple swell of a bruise darkening her cheekbone, stark against the pale skin. He ignored the warning bells ringing in the back of his mind. The instinct that told him a woman battered and freezing in the middle of nowhere brought nothing but trouble. He slid his arms under her knees and back, lifting her. She was light, dangerously so, as if the cold had already hollowed her out. The ride back to the ranch house was a race against the dark. Silas held her across his lap, wrapping his own coat around her, trying to share what little body heat he had. The landscape rolled by in an indifferent blur of white hills and black pine. The sky offered no mercy, closing in with the weight of the coming night. His ranch house stood alone in a valley of wind-sculpted drifts. It was a rough-hewn structure of logs and mud chinking, built for survival, not comfort. Smoke whipped from the chimney. a signal of the coals he had banked before leaving that morning. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the wind. The sudden silence of the room was jarring. The air smelled of wood smoke, stale coffee, and the oil he used to clean his tack. He laid her on the narrow cot near the potbelly stove, the only bed in the house. He worked quickly, fueled by a grim pragmatism. He built up the fire until the iron stove ticked and groaned with heat. Then he turned to her. She was shivering now, violent tremors that rattled her teeth. The thaw was starting, and with it would come the pain. He needed to get the wet clothes off her. Silas hesitated, his hands hovering over the buttons of the oversized coat. He was a bachelor who had lived alone for 10 years. The intimacy of this felt wrong, an intrusion. But the wet wool was killing her. "Forgive me, ma'am," he muttered to the empty room. He peeled the coat away. Beneath it, the dress was ruined, torn at the shoulder and muddy at the hem. He saw more bruises, dark fingerprints gripping her upper arm, a yellowing mark on her collarbone. Someone had handled her rough. He removed her boots, which were scuffed and thin-soled, wholly unsuited for the range. Then he saw the blood. It had soaked through the heavy stockings on her right leg, drying into a stiff, black crust. Silas cursed softly. He took his knife and carefully slit the stocking, peeling the fabric away from the skin. The wound was ugly. A deep, jagged gash ran along the outside of her thigh, maybe 4 inches long. It looked like she had snagged it on barbed wire or a sharp branch while running in the dark. The edges were angry and red, and the flesh was torn deep. It had bled significantly, and now that the warmth of the room was hitting it, fresh blood was beginning to ooze. He looked at her face. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and fast. "I am no doctor," Silas said, wiping his hands on a rag. "But if I leave that, the fever will take you before sunrise." He moved to the stove. He filled a basin with water and set it on the hot iron to boil. He found a clean strip of white cotton from an old flour sack and tore it into bandages. Then he went to the small tin box on the mantel where he kept his mending kit. He took out a needle, a thick, sturdy thing meant for canvas and denim, and a spool of heavy thread. He dropped the needle into the boiling water, watching it rattle against the tin bottom. When he turned back, her eyes were open. They were wide, dark, and filled with a frantic, glassy confusion. She was pushing herself up on her elbows, scrambling backward on the cot, pressing herself against the rough log wall. "No," she rasped. Her voice was a broken whisper. "No, no, no. You are safe," Silas said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he spoke to a spooked colt. "You are at the Double Bar Ranch. I found you in the snow." She looked around wildly, her chest heaving. Her gaze darted to the door, then to the window. Black with night. "I have to leave," she said, trying to swing her legs off the cot. The movement pulled at the gash on her leg, and she gasped, squeezing her eyes shut as the pain hit her. "You are not going anywhere," Silas said. "You are half frozen, and you are hurt bad. I cannot be here," she insisted. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and her fear spiked. To her, he was just a large, looming shape in the dim light. A man with a scarred hand and a gun belt hanging on the chair. "What is your name?" Silas asked. She clamped her mouth shut. Her jaw trembled. "All right," he said. "No name then, but you have a cut on your leg that needs tending." He walked to the stove and used a pair of tongs to fish the needle out of the boiling water. He set it on a clean cloth. He poured some of the hot water into a bowl and added a splash of whiskey from the bottle on the table to clean it. When he turned back to the cot, holding the needle and thread, the woman went rigid. She stared at the needle in his hand. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were almost entirely black. The sight of the metal seemed to unlock something inside her, a memory so visceral it overrode the pain of the cold. "No," she whispered. Silas stepped closer. "I have to stitch it up. Miss, it is deep." She scrambled back until she hit the wall, trapping herself. Her breathing turned into ragged, hyperventilating gasps. She looked from his face to the needle, her mind clearly not in this cabin anymore, but back in whatever hell she had run from. "Please," she begged. "It will only take a minute." Silas said gently. He reached for her ankle to steady her leg. And then she screamed. It was a raw, terrifying sound that seemed to tear her throat. She kicked out at him, scrambling away, her hands clawing at the blanket. "You want to put it in?" she shrieked. Silas froze. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a horror he did not understand. She was not talking about the needle. He could see it in the way she curled in on herself, protecting her body, her eyes squeezed shut to block out a nightmare. The phrase was specific. It was a plea he was never meant to hear, a desperate beg from a moment of violence. "You want to put it in?" she screamed again, sobbing the words. "Please, not again. I cannot take it. Do not put it in." Silas stood perfectly still. The needle was pinched between his thumb and forefinger. He felt a cold sensation wash over him that had nothing to do with the winter draft. He understood now. The bruises, the town clothes, the terror of men. He lowered his hand slowly, placing the needle and thread on the table behind him, out of her sight. He kept his palms open and visible. "Miss," he said. She was rocking back and forth, sobbing into her knees. "Look at me," Silas commanded, though he kept his voice soft. She did not look. "I am not him," Silas said. The sobbing hitched. "I am not the man who hurt you," he said. "I am just a rancher with a needle, trying to close a cut so you do not bleed out." "That is all I am putting anywhere." She lifted her head slowly. Her face was wet with tears, her expression shattered. She looked at his hands. They were empty. "I am asking," Silas said, meeting her gaze with a steadiness he did not feel. "I am not taking. If you say no, I will walk out that door and let you be. But you will likely lose that leg." She stared at him, her chest rising and falling in jerky rhythms. The silence stretched out, filled only by the pop of the firewood. She looked at the wound on her leg, then back at his face. She was searching for a lie in his eyes. "Do it," she whispered. Her voice was so faint he almost missed it. Silas nodded once. He pulled the wooden chair over to the side of the cot and sat down. He picked up the needle again. "I am going to clean it first," he said. "It will sting." She gripped the edges of the cot until her knuckles turned white. Silas worked with grim care. He washed the wound with the whiskey water, his hands moving efficiently. She hissed through her teeth but did not pull away. Then came the stitching. He had sewn up horses and cattle, and he had sewn up his own arm once after a knife slipped. But this was different. Her skin was soft, pale, and shivering. He had to lean close, his head bent near her thigh to see in the lantern light. The intimacy of it was accidental, but it was overwhelming. The heat of her skin radiated against his hand. He could smell the scent of her, sweat and fear, and the faint, lingering perfume of lavender soap that belonged to a life far from this cabin. Every time the needle pierced her skin, she flinched. "Sorry," he murmured. He stopped whenever she began to shake too hard, waiting for her to settle. He let her set the pace. He did not hold her leg down. He rested his hand on her shin. A grounding weight, ready to lift if she panicked. 1 stitch, 2 stitches, 3. His jaw was clenched so hard his teeth ached. He focused entirely on the task, pretending that the closeness meant nothing, pretending that the way her breath hitched every time his hand grazed her skin did not make his own heart hammer against his ribs. "There," he said finally, tying off the thread and snipping it with the knife. "It is done." He wrapped the wound in the clean cotton strips. The woman slumped back against the pillow, exhausted. She turned her face to the wall and began to weep. It was not the frantic screaming of before. It was a quiet, desolate sobbing born of pain and a shame Silas could not begin to measure. She cried for the exposure, for the helplessness, for the memory of whatever had happened before she found herself in the snow. Silas stood up. He gathered the bloody rags in the basin. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He did not try to comfort her. He knew, with a certainty born of his own scars, that she could not bear a man's touch right now, no matter how kind. "Rest," he said gruffly. He took the basin outside to dump the bloody water. The wind hit him, cold and clean, scrubbing the smell of the sick room from his nose. He stood on the porch for a long moment, breathing in the icy air, trying to slow his own pulse. When he went back inside, she was quiet. She had pulled the blanket up to her chin, her eyes closed, though he knew she was not asleep. The air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just a shelter. It was charged, frightened, and dangerously alive. Silas moved to the small kitchen area and began to make coffee. He needed something to do with his hands. A movement outside the window caught his eye. The morning was just beginning to break, a gray light seeping over the eastern ridges. A horse and rider were passing along the track that ran past his gate, a public right-of-way that saved travelers 2 miles on the way to town. It was the Miller boy, Toby, a teenager with big ears and a loose tongue. Silas stepped toward the window, intending to wave him on, but he stopped. Toby had slowed his horse. He was staring at the ranch house, through the glass. Silas realized with a jolt what the boy could see. The lantern was still lit. The woman was lying on the cot, her profile clear against the light. Her dark hair spilled over the pillow. The blanket slipped down enough to show the bare shoulder where the dress was torn. Silas cursed and blew out the lantern, plunging the room into gloom. But it was too late. He saw Toby kick his horse into a gallop, tearing off toward the town of Granite Creek. The boy had seen a strange woman in Silas Thorne's bed at dawn, looking disheveled and broken. He did not understand what he had seen, which meant he would make up a story to fill in the blanks. By noon, the saloon and the general store would be buzzing. The woman on the cot stirred. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight. "Just a neighbor?" Silas lied. Was he going to town? Silas hesitated. "Yes," she sat up, ignoring the pain in her leg. "They will come looking for me." "Who?" Silas asked. She did not answer. She was looking at the door, her eyes wide again. "I have to leave. You cannot ride," Silas said. "And you have no horse. They will follow my tracks." She said, "They are trackers. They are paid to be." Silas looked at her. The panic was back, but it was a cold, calculating panic now. She was right. If she had run from powerful men, they would have men looking for her. And the snow that had saved her by slowing her bleeding would betray her by holding her trail. He made a decision. "Stay here," he said. He grabbed his rifle and his heavy coat. He went out to the barn and saddled Buster again. He rode back to where he had found her. The wind had covered some of the sign, but the drag marks were still visible in the shelter of the cut. Silas spent the next hour riding back and forth over the trail, driving a small herd of his cattle over the area, churning the snow into a muddy, hoof-marked mess that obliterated any human sign. He created a false trail leading away from his land, toward the rocky breaks to the south where the ground was too hard to hold a print. When he returned to the house, the sun was fully up. He went inside. The woman was sitting exactly where he had left her, clutching the blanket. "I muddied the trail," Silas said, hanging his hat on the peg. "If they come, they will not find tracks leading to this door." He walked over to the cot. "I am going to move you." "Where?" "The back room. It has no windows. If anyone rides up, you stay quiet. You do not make a sound. Do you understand?" She nodded. He helped her limp to the small storage room he used for supplies. He made a pallet on the floor with bearskins and quilts. It was dark and smelled of flour and dried apples, but it was hidden. "I will bring you food," he said. He left the door ajar so she would not be in total darkness. That night, Silas did not sleep in his bed. He pulled the wooden chair to the center of the main room, facing the door. He placed the Winchester rifle across his knees. The wind howled around the eaves, sounding like voices. Every creak of the timber made him tighten his grip on the gun. He thought about the bruises on her arm. He thought about the scream, "You want to put it in," and the sheer, abject terror in her eyes. He wondered what kind of man could reduce a woman to that, and he wondered what he would do when that man came knocking. From the back room, he heard the woman restless in her sleep. The fever was rising again. She was muttering, tossing against the quilts. Silas listened. Suddenly, her voice came clear through the darkness, sharp and pleading. "No, no, Mr. Kingman, please." The name hung in the cold air like a gunshot. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He looked down at the rifle in his lap. Kingman. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Jeremiah Kingman, the cattle baron who owned half the valley, the man who bought judges and owned sheriffs, the man whose wealth built the church and whose wrath burned down homesteads. Silas looked toward the dark doorway of the back room. She had not just wandered in from bad luck. She had fled from the devil himself. And now, Silas Thorne was the only thing standing between her and hell. He thumbed the hammer of the rifle, checking the action one more time, and settled in to wait for the dawn. The thaw did not arrive with the grace of spring. It arrived like a fever breaking, messy and wet. The Chinook winds blew down from the mountains, warm and relentless, turning the high drifts of the Wyoming territory into rushing rivulets of dirty water. The earth, frozen hard as iron for months, softened into a treacherous, sucking mud that the locals called gumbo. It clung to boots, caked the bellies of horses, and turned the simple act of walking from the house to the barn into a labor of exhaustion. For Silas Thorne, the mud meant work. It meant digging drainage ditches to keep the corral from flooding, checking the hooves of his horses for rot, and mending the roof where the heavy snow had loosened the shingles. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life shifted as well. The woman, he still thought of her only as the woman, for she had offered no name and he had not pressed for one, was healing. The fever that had burned through her for 3 days finally receded, leaving her pale and hollow-cheeked, but clear-eyed. She was not the invalid he had expected. Silas came in one afternoon, stomping the mud from his boots on the porch, his arms full of split pine. He stopped in the doorway. The woman was standing at the kitchen table. She was leaning heavily on the table with one hand, her injured leg taking no weight, but with the other hand, she was kneading the dough he had set to rise that morning. "You should be off that leg," Silas said, dropping the wood into the box by the stove. She did not look up, but her hands continued their work, folding and pressing the dough with a rhythmic, practiced motion. "I cannot lie in that bed another hour," she said. Her voice was stronger now, though it still carried a rough edge from the cold air she had swallowed. "And you are burning your biscuits. A man who works as hard as you do deserves bread that does not taste like charcoal." Silas watched her. He had expected a town woman, soft and useless, in a kitchen. Perhaps the spoiled daughter of a merchant or a banker's wife used to servants. But he watched the way she handled the dough, the efficiency of her knuckles, the strength in her wrists. He walked closer, pretending to check the coffee pot. He looked at her hands. They were small, yes, but the palms were not smooth. There were calluses along the base of the fingers and a thickening of the skin on the side of her index finger. "Those are not the hands of a woman who spends her days embroidering," Silas noted quietly. She froze for a second, then resumed kneading. Harder this time. "I have worked," she said simply. "Doing what?" Whatever was needed. It was a deflection, but it told him enough. She was competent. She knew how to bank a fire, how to peel potatoes without wasting the flesh, and how to scrub a shirt until the collar was white again. She moved around his small kitchen with a wince of pain every time her bad leg touched the floor. Yet she refused to sit until the work was done. It unsettled him. It made her presence feel less like a temporary emergency and more like a domestic reality. Over the next week, the silence between them began to fill with cautious bridges. They ate dinner at the small table while the wind rattled the window panes. The oil lamp cast a warm, golden circle between them, holding the dark corners of the room at bay. He learned to read her silences. When she went still and stared at the dark glass of the window, she was remembering. When she rubbed the fabric of her skirt between her thumb and finger, she was afraid. One evening, while Silas was oiling his saddle leathers, she spoke up. "How did you get that scar?" she asked. Silas looked down at his left hand. A jagged white line ran from his wrist across the back of his hand, disappearing into his sleeve. "Barbed wire," he said. "First year I fenced the north pasture. A coil snapped back on me. It cuts deep if you do not respect the tension." She nodded, looking at the scar as if it were a map. "It looks painful," It was, Silas admitted. But it healed. Things mostly do, if you keep the dirt out of them. He looked at her then. The bruise on her cheek was fading to a sickly yellow, and the cut on her leg was knitting together, the stitches holding fast. But the way she sat, shoulders hunched forward as if expecting a blow, told him some things were not healing. "You jump when the wind hits the door," Silas said. It was not a question. She looked down at her lap. "And you check the lock 3 times before you sleep," he added. She did not deny it. "Fear is a habit," Silas said, dipping his rag back into the neat's foot oil. "It takes longer to break than a wild horse." She looked up at him, her eyes dark and searching. "You sound like you know." Silas paused. He thought of the empty chair on the other side of the room, the one he never sat in. He thought of a grave marker on the hill behind the house that the snow had finally melted enough to reveal. "I know that looking over your shoulder wears a person down," he said. "You are safe here. Miss, the door is thick, the rifle is loaded, and I am a light sleeper." It was the most he had said to anyone in years. She watched him, her expression unreadable, listening like a person starving for reassurance but terrified to believe it. While the ranch remained a sanctuary, the town of Granite Creek was festering. Rumor in a small western town travels faster than a telegraph wire. It moves through the wash lines, over the fences, and across the polished counters of the saloon. And the story of the woman at the Double Bar Ranch had grown legs. The Miller boy had told his mother what he saw: a woman in the rancher's bed, disheveled, the lantern light on her bare skin. His mother had told the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, and Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was only exceeded by her malice, had supplied the context. Silas rode into town 10 days after finding the woman. He needed flour, coffee, and fresh rounds for his Winchester. The moment he tied Buster to the hitching rail outside the general store, he felt the change. Usually, the men on the porch would nod or touch the brims of their hats. Silas was not a popular man. He was too quiet, too solitary, but he was respected. He paid his debts and minded his own business. Today, the porch was silent. 3 men stood there, cattle hands from the Kingman spread and a local drifting blacksmith. They watched him mount the steps. One of them, a man with a tobacco stain on his chin, leaned over and whispered something to the others. They laughed, a low, ugly sound. Silas ignored them. He pushed into the store. The warmth of the potbelly stove usually made the store a gathering place. But today the air felt brittle. The shopkeeper, a balding man named Mr. Henderson, was weighing nails for a customer. Silas walked to the counter. "Morning. Henderson." Henderson did not look up. He poured the nails into a sack. "I will be with you in a minute." "Thorne." The tone was dismissive. Silas waited. He felt eyes boring into his back. 2 women were looking at fabric bolts in the corner. He heard the whisper, sharp and sibilant. Screaming it, they say, begging for it. Shameless. "You want to put it in?" That is what she said. Silas stiffened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The phrase the woman had screamed in her delirium, the terrified plea of a torture victim, had been caught by the wind or a listening ear. Perhaps the Miller boy had heard more than he admitted, and now, the town had taken that moment of pure horror and twisted it into something filthy. They had turned her trauma into a lewd joke. Henderson finally turned to him. "What do you need?" 50 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of coffee, a box of 4440. Henderson fetched the items, slapping them onto the counter with unnecessary force. "That will be $4. Silas paid as he gathered his supplies. Henderson leaned in, his voice dropping to a fake, oily concern. "You know, Silas, folks are talking. A man living alone out there, bringing in strays, it does not look good." Silas met the shopkeeper's gaze. His eyes were the color of flint. "I did not know my living arrangements were the town's business." "Henderson, everything is the town's business when it involves decency." Henderson sniffed. Silas picked up his flour sack. If anyone has a question about my decency, they can ride out and ask me to my face. Tell them that." He walked out. The men on the porch went silent again as he passed, but he could feel their sneers like a physical weight. These were men who spent their Saturday nights in the back rooms of the saloons, paying for company. Yet, in the daylight, they stood in judgment of a woman they had never met. He loaded his horse and led it toward the livery to water it. "Well met. Silas." The voice was smooth, friendly. Silas stopped. Sheriff Brady was leaning against a post, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. He was a man with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, which were hard and calculating. "Sheriff," Silas nodded. "Buying supplies for two?" Brady asked, his eyes flicking to the large sack of flour. "A man has to eat," Silas said. "True." Brady stepped off the boardwalk, closing the distance. He lowered his voice. "Heard you had a visitor? A woman." Silas kept his face impassive. "Found a traveler caught in the storm. She was half dead. Is that so?" Brady tilted his head. "Who is she?" "She did not say." Brady chuckled, but it was dry. "A woman with no name. That is unusual. You know, Jeremiah Kingman was asking about a runaway. A servant girl who stole some silver and bolted. You haven't seen a thief out there." "Have you, Silas?" Silas felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. The accusation of theft was the oldest trick in the book to legalize a hunt. "I found a woman freezing in a snowbank," Silas said evenly. "She was not carrying any silver, just frostbite." Brady stared at him for a long moment. The friendly facade slipped. "Just a fraction. Be careful. Silas, Kingman is not a man who likes to lose his property. And this town, well, we like things orderly. We do not like scandals. If you are harboring a criminal, even a pretty one, the law cannot help you." "The law does not seem interested in help," Silas said. "Only in returning property." Brady's smile tightened. "Just a friendly warning. Get her moving, Silas, before the mud dries." Silas mounted his horse and rode out of town. He did not look back, but he knew they were watching. When he returned to the ranch, the sun was setting. The woman was waiting by the stove. She looked at his face as he came in, reading the tension in the set of his jaw. "What happened?" she asked. Silas unloaded the supplies. "Nothing, just talk." She came closer. "You are bleeding." Silas looked down. In his anger, loading the wagon, he had snagged his knuckles on a loose nail on the buckboard. It was a shallow scratch, but it was bleeding sluggishly. "It is nothing," he said. "Sit," she commanded. He sat. She fetched the basin and the cloth, the same basin he had used to clean her leg. She took his hand in hers. Her skin was warm. The sensation of her fingers on his rough, scarred hand was electric. The room seemed to shrink until there was nothing but the two of them and the crackle of the fire. She washed the blood away gently. She did not flinch from his roughness. "They say things about me, do they not?" she asked quietly, not looking up. Silas did not lie to her. "Yeah, they say I am a whore," she guessed, "or worse." "They say you are a fallen woman," Silas said, "because a boy saw you here, and because people have dirty minds to cover their own dirty souls." She stopped washing. She held his hand, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "I came from a house that everyone respects," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "A big house, with velvet curtains and polished silver. The man who owns it. He is a pillar of the community. He gives money to the church. He hosts the governor for dinner." She looked up at Silas. Her eyes were swimming with tears she refused to shed. But inside that house, he likes to break things. He likes to take things that do not belong to him and see how much pain they can hold before they shatter. I was a maid, then I was a favorite, and when I tried to say no, she stopped. She did not say the name Kingman. She did not have to. He has friends. She whispered, "Powerful friends." "I met one today," Silas said. "The sheriff." She went pale. "He knows. He suspects." They sat in silence. Her hand was still holding his. The connection was terrifying. Silas felt a pull toward her that he had not felt in 10 years. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to block out the wind and the town and the sheriff. He wanted to promise her that he would kill anyone who tried to touch her again, but he also knew that his desire was dangerous. She was vulnerable. She was dependent on him. If he crossed that line, he was no better than the men she fled from. He gently pulled his hand away. "You are safe here," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He stood up and walked to the window, putting distance between them. "Listen to me," he said, keeping his back to her. "You stay as long as you need. No one comes through that door unless you say so. No one touches you. Not the sheriff, not Kingman, and not me." He turned to face her. "I am a man," he said, "and I have eyes, but I will not add to your burdens. You sleep in the back room. I sleep out here. That is the way it is." She looked at him, and he saw a flash of something in her eyes. Not relief, but a sudden, sharp disappointment that mirrored his own. "Thank you," she said. But the way she looked at him, and the way he looked back, broke every rule he had just set. The air between them hummed with a yearning that was more dangerous than any gun. 2 days later, the pressure escalated. It was Sunday. The wind carried the faint sound of church bells from the town, miles away. Silas was in the barn when a rider approached. It was Vance, the foreman of the Kingman Ranch, a thick-necked man who rode a horse that cost more than Silas's entire herd. He did not dismount. He rode up to the fence where Silas was working. "Thorne." Vance grunted. "Vance, boss wanted me to deliver a message." Silas waited. "The grazing rights on the north section, the ones you lease from the county? The boss thinks they might need review. Says he's thinking of expanding his herd. Says the county might prefer a tenant who contributes more to the moral fiber of the community." It was a direct threat. Kingman could outbid Silas for the lease easily. Without that grass, Silas's herd would starve. "Tell your boss that my lease is paid through the year," Silas said. Vance smirked. "Contracts can be broken. Thorne, especially when there is a character clause. You might want to think about cleaning house, get rid of the trash, and maybe you keep your land." Vance wheeled his horse and rode off. Silas stood gripping the fence post until the wood groaned. When he went back to the house, the woman, Clara, he had decided to call her in his mind, though he'd never said it aloud, was standing by the window. She was peering through a crack in the shutter. She was trembling. "Who was that?" she asked. "Just a foreman." "No," she said. "Not him. The other one?" "What other one?" "On the ridge." Silas went to the window. He looked up toward the high ground to the east. There, silhouetted against the gray sky, was a solitary rider. He was sitting motionless, watching the house. Silas grabbed his spyglass from the shelf. He focused on the figure. The man was sitting with a distinct, upright posture. He wore a long duster coat and a flat-brimmed hat. He was not a cowboy. He looked like a hunter. "He is a retriever," the woman whispered. She had backed away from the window, wrapping her arms around herself. "He hires them to bring back livestock and runaways." Her body went cold with dread. Silas could see the blood drain from her face. She looked like she was about to bolt, to run out the back door and disappear into the breaks. "No," Silas said. He lowered the spyglass. "We are done hiding," he said firmly. She looked at him. "What?" "Hiding makes us look guilty," Silas said. "It feeds the rumors. It gives them power. If we skulk around in the dark, they will hunt us in the dark." He walked over to her. "Get your coat," he said. "Why? Where are we going?" "Town," Silas said. "Are you mad?" she cried. "They will see me. That is the point," Silas said. "I am taking you to see the doctor to check that leg properly, and then I am buying you a coat that fits, and we are going to do it at high noon on a Tuesday, but they will—" "Let them stare," Silas interrupted. "Let them see that you are not a ghost and not a whore. You are a human being under my protection. We are going to walk down that boardwalk with our heads up." He grabbed his hat. "If we hide, we die," he said. "If we stand, we might just have a chance. Do you trust me?" She looked at him. The fear was still there, wild and fluttering, but beneath it was something else, a spark of defiance that he had kindled. She took a deep breath. She nodded. The ride into town was a gauntlet. Silas hitched the team to the buckboard wagon. The woman sat beside him, wrapped in blankets, her face pale but set like stone. When they rolled onto Main Street, the town of Granite Creek seemed to stop. The blacksmith lowered his hammer. The women sweeping their porches paused, leaning on their brooms. The door to the saloon swung open and men spilled out, squinting in the sunlight. Silas drove the wagon straight down the center of the street. He looked neither left nor right. He pulled up in front of the doctor's office. He set the brake. He walked around the wagon and held up his hand to help her down. For a moment, she hesitated. The eyes of the town were pressing on her. 100 judgments. 1,000 cruel whispers. Then, she placed her hand in his. Silas gripped her fingers tight. He helped her down. She stumbled slightly on her bad leg, and he steadied her, his hand firm on her waist. He saw misses. Gable gasped from the sidewalk. He saw the men leering, their eyes raking over her makeshift clothes. He saw Sheriff Brady stepping out of his office, his smile gone, his eyes narrowing. Silas did not hurry. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked across the boardwalk. The sound of their boots was loud in the silence. "They are looking at us," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Let them look," Silas said loud enough for the nearest gawkers to hear. "It is rude to stare, but we cannot teach manners to hogs." He opened the door to the doctor's office and ushered her inside. As the door clicked shut, cutting off the street, Silas looked through the glass. The town was buzzing now. The hive had been kicked. The outrage was collective and palpable. But as he looked at the sheriff, who was now staring at the wagon with a look of pure venom, Silas knew one thing for certain. He had just declared war. He had taken the woman's side against the town, against the church, and against the cattle baron. There was no going back now. He looked down at the woman. She was leaning against the counter, breathing hard, but her head was high. "You did good," Silas said. She looked at him, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "We are in trouble, are we not?" she asked. Silas adjusted his gun belt. "Yes, ma'am. He said, 'We surely are. Spring arrived not with flowers, but with violence.'" The snowmelt roared down from the peaks, turning the creek into a brown, frothing torrent that chewed at the banks and threatened the lower pastures. The ground, unable to drink fast enough, turned into a slurrying trap of mud that sucked boots off feet and exhausted the horses within a mile. It was calving season for Silas Thorne. This meant the end of sleep. The heifers were dropping their calves in the cold rain, and if a man was not there to pull a breech or clear a mucus-clogged nose, the investment of a year died in the mud. Clara, she had allowed him to use the name now, though she still flinched when he said it too loudly, worked beside him. She wrapped herself in an old oilskin slicker that smelled of linseed and sweat, wading through the muck with a lantern in one hand and a bundle of clean sacking in the other. One night, the rain was coming down in sheets, cold enough to turn to sleet on the wind. They had been in the calving shed for 6 hours straight. A young heifer was in distress. The calf turned wrong inside her. Silas stripped off his coat and rolled his sleeves to the shoulder. He lay in the straw behind the straining animal, his arm deep inside, fighting the contractions to turn the calf's legs. "Hold the light steady," he grunted, sweat mingling with the rain on his forehead. Clara did not waver. She knelt in the filth, holding the lantern high, her other hand stroking the heifer's heaving flank, murmuring soft, nonsensical sounds that seemed to calm the beast. When the calf finally slid out, wet and steaming in the cold air, Silas slumped back against the stall wall, his chest heaving. Clara moved instantly, clearing the calf's mouth, rubbing its ribs with the sacking until it coughed and took its first jagged breath. She looked up at Silas, her face smeared with mud and straw, her hair plastered to her skull. She was exhausted, shivering, and covered in afterbirth, and Silas thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They sat there for a long time in the silence of the shed, listening to the mother lick her calf. The adrenaline faded, leaving a heavy, bone-deep weariness that lowered all defenses. "You have good hands," Silas said quietly. Clara looked at her hands, stained and shaking. "I learned to be useful. It was the only way to avoid notice." Silas wiped his face with a rag. "I had a wife once, Sarah." Clara went still. It was the first time he had spoken her name. "She died 12 years ago," Silas continued, his voice flat, staring at the lantern flame. "It was the fever. It took her and the baby in the same week. I buried them on the ridge behind the house." He looked at Clara. "Since then, I have been a ghost. I wake up, I work, I sleep. I do not feel the cold. I do not taste the food. I have been a man half buried, just waiting for the dirt to fill in the rest." He paused, the confession hanging in the damp air. "But since you came, the dirt is gone. I feel the cold again. I worry. I feel awake." Clara looked away, her throat working. She picked at a loose thread on the sacking. "I was not just a maid. Silas," she whispered. He did not speak. He waited. In that house, in Kingman's house, I was a decoration, a pet. The men who came to dinner, senators, judges, cattlemen, they would look at me while they smoked their cigars. They would touch my arm, my hair, as if I were a piece of velvet upholstery. She hugged her knees to her chest. They called themselves respectable men. They went to church on Sundays, but in that library, with the brandy poured, they were wolves. And the wives knew. They looked at me with such hate, as if I were the one choosing it. As if I were stealing their husbands, when all I wanted was to be invisible." She looked up, her eyes fierce and wet. "They made me feel like an object, something to be used and put back on the shelf. That is why I ran. I would rather freeze in a ditch than be a thing on a shelf for one more day." Silas reached out. He did not touch her, but he laid his hand on the straw between them. "You are no object here. Clara, you are the one holding the light." The bond forged in the mud of the calving shed followed them into the daylight, but the world outside the ranch was tightening its grip. Silas rode into town a week later for grain. The reception was colder than the winter wind. At the feed store, the price of oats had jumped. $2 a sack, the clerk said, not meeting Silas's eyes. "It was $1 last month," Silas noted. "Shortage," the clerk mumbled. "Take it or leave it." "Thorn." Silas paid, his jaw tight. He knew there was no shortage. He went to the saloon for a meal, a rare indulgence he usually allowed himself. The bartender, a man Silas had known for 10 years, placed a glass of water on the bar but no menu. "Kitchen is closed," the bartender said, wiping a spot that wasn't dirty. "It is noon," Silas said. "Closed to you." "Silas." The bartender leaned in. "Look, I do not want trouble, but the boys from the Kingman spread. They drink here, they spend money here. They said if I serve the man who harbors the woman, then they take their business to the next county." Silas looked at the man. "I understand. Money talks louder than friendship." He walked out. On the way back to the wagon, he was intercepted by Mrs. Gable and 2 other women from the church auxiliary. They blocked his path on the boardwalk, their skirts rustling like dry leaves. "Mr. Thorne." "Mrs." Gable said, her voice dripping with a sugary poison. "We prepared a charity basket for your guest." She held out a basket covered with a gingham cloth. Silas took it. Surprised. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. That is kind." He lifted the cloth. Inside, there was no food. There was a worn-out, moth-eaten gray dress, the kind a penitent might wear, and a stack of religious tracts with titles like "The Path of the Fallen" and "Redemption for the Harlot." Silas stared at the basket. The heat rose in his neck. "We thought you might need something appropriate to wear." "Mrs." Gable sniffed, to cover her shame. Silas slowly replaced the cloth. He handed the basket back to Mrs. Gable. "My guest is not in need of rags." "Mrs. Gable. And as for her soul, I reckon it is cleaner than the souls of those who use charity as a whip." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving them gasping on the sidewalk like landed fish. He tried one last avenue. A circuit judge, Judge Halloway, was passing through Granite Creek on his semi-annual rotation. Silas caught him outside the hotel. "Judge," Silas said, "I need a word about the law." Holloway was a tired man with whiskey-veined cheeks. He listened as Silas explained the situation, the threats, the sabotage of his reputation, the predatory nature of the men hunting Clara. The judge sighed, lighting a cigar. "Silas, you are a good man, but you are asking me to stand in front of a train. I am asking you to uphold the law," Silas said. "The law requires evidence," Holloway said, "and witnesses. Do you have a witness who will testify against Jeremiah Kingman? A man who owns the bank that holds the mortgage on this hotel? A man who pays the sheriff's salary because the county tax coffers are empty?" He puffed smoke into the air. "In this territory, Mr. Thorne, the law is a thin shield. Money is the sword, and Kingman has the biggest sword. If you want my advice, give the girl back, or send her to California. But do not try to fight a war you cannot finance." Silas rode home with the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. He realized then that there was no institutional help coming. He and Clara were on their own. The isolation pushed them closer. The ranch house became a fortress. But inside, the air was thick with things unspoken. The desire was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, rising tide. It was in the way they moved around each other in the small kitchen, a choreography of avoidance that was intensely aware. One evening, Silas was repairing a bridle at the table. Clara was passing behind him to reach the stove. The hallway was narrow. As she squeezed past, her skirt brushed his leg. He smelled the soap on her skin, mixed with the scent of flour and rain. He stopped working. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. For a second, neither moved. The heat between them was palpable, a magnetic pull that made Silas's hands tremble. He wanted to turn, to catch her hand, to pull her into his lap. He could feel that she was waiting for it, or perhaps fearing it. Then she moved on, and the moment broke, leaving them both shaken. It came to a head on a Tuesday night. The wolves had been vocal all week, sensing the vulnerable calves. Around midnight, the barking of the ranch dogs turned into a frenzy. Silas was out of bed in a second, grabbing his rifle. Clara was right behind him, pulling on her boots. They ran out into the dark. The wolves were at the fence line, gray shapes darting in the moonlight. Silas fired 2 shots into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing off the canyon walls. The pack scattered, yipping into the trees. They checked the fence. It held. The calves were spooked but safe. They walked back to the house, the adrenaline singing in their blood. The wind was cold, but their bodies were hot from the run. Inside, Silas stirred the fire back to life. Clara stood near the hearth, shivering now as the shock wore off. That was close. She breathed. Silas put the rifle back on the rack. He turned to look at her. Her hair was wild, her eyes bright. She looked fierce and alive. He walked over to her. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him. The firelight danced on her face. "Yes," she whispered. She did not step back. She stepped forward. The distance between them vanished. Silas looked down at her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She tilted her head back, her lips parting slightly. Her eyes searched his, wide and vulnerable. She leaned in. Her hands came up, hovering near his chest, then touching the rough wool of his shirt. It was an offer. It was a surrender. And Silas saw the tremble in her lower lip. He saw the shadow of fear behind the desire, the ingrained belief that she had to give something to be allowed to stay. He froze. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to take her, to kiss her, to lose himself in the warmth she was offering. But he saw the ghost of the man she ran from standing between them. He reached up and gently took her wrists. He pulled her hands away from his chest. "Clara," he said, his voice rough as gravel. She stopped. Her face crumbled slightly, confusion and shame rushing in. Am I not?" she stammered. Silas stepped back, putting a foot of cold air between them. It felt like tearing his own skin off. "No," he said firmly. "Do not do that." She wrapped her arms around herself, shrinking away. "I'm sorry. I thought..." I thought you wanted— I do, Silas said. The truth tore out of him. I want you more than I have wanted anything in 10 years. She looked at him, stunned. But not like this, Silas said. You think this is the price. You think because I feed you and fight for you. You owe me this. He shook his head. You do not pay for safety here. Clara, not with your body, not with anything. You are safe because you are a human being, not because you are useful to me in the dark. Clara stared at him. The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over, hot and fast. No one. She whispered. No one has ever said that. Silas looked at her, his hands clenched at his sides to keep from reaching for her. Go to bed, Clara, before I forget my own rules. She fled to the back room. Silas sat by the fire until dawn, staring at the flames, aching in every part of his body, but knowing he had done the only thing that could save them both. The war arrived 2 days later in the form of a buggy. 2 men drove up the track. They were not cowboys. They wore town suits and bowler hats, but their eyes were dead, like the eyes of sharks. They moved with the casual arrogance of men who carried authority in their pockets. Silas met them on the porch, his rifle in the crook of his arm. Gentlemen, Silas said, you are lost. The driver, a man with a thin mustache, smiled. Mr. Thorne, I am Mr. Paddock. This is Mr. Graves. We represent the Kingman estate. I have no business with the estate, Silas said. We have a warrant, Paddock said, pulling a folded paper from his coat. Signed by Sheriff Brady. It authorizes the retrieval of stolen property, specifically a silver tea service and a diamond brooch, believed to be in the possession of a former domestic servant named Clara. We know she is here, Graves added, his voice like dry leaves. She has nothing of yours, Silas said. Then you won't mind us searching the premises, Paddock said, stepping toward the stairs, and taking the girl into custody for questioning. Silas shifted the rifle. The barrel did not point at them, but it was no longer pointing at the ground. You are not stepping on this porch, Silas said. Paddock stopped. You are threatening officers of the court. I am telling trespassers to leave, Silas said. That paper is worth less than the ink on it. There is no stolen silver. This is a kidnapping dressed up as law. Graves opened his coat, revealing a heavy pistol in a shoulder holster. Careful. Rancher. You are one man. We can burn this coop down around your ears and take her from the ashes. Silas cocked the hammer of the Winchester. The sound was loud in the quiet afternoon. You might, Silas said, but you will be the first to burn. The standoff stretched. A thin wire pulled to the breaking point. Paddock looked at Silas's eyes. He saw a man who had already buried everything he loved and had nothing left to lose. Paddock scoffed, folding the paper. Have it your way, Thorne, but you cannot stay awake forever. And the law has a long reach. They climbed back into the buggy and reversed, driving away slowly, their eyes fixed on the house. Clara came out from the back room. She was white as a sheet. They will come back, she said. Silas watched the buggy disappear. Yes, that night, the violence shifted from threats to action. Silas patrolled the perimeter until midnight, then dozed in the chair by the door. He was woken by a sound that no rancher ever wants to hear, the scream of a horse in pain. He burst out the door, running toward the barn. The door was swinging open. Inside, the air smelled of coal oil. They hadn't lit the fire. Perhaps the damp wood refused to catch, but they had done damage. Silas's tack, his saddles, his bridles, the tools of his trade, had been slashed to ribbons. Leather hung in strips. The grain bins had been overturned. The feed mixed with kerosene to poison it, and in the center of the aisle lay one of his prize calves. Its throat had been cut, carved into the wooden post above the dead animal. Crude and deep were words, whore's price. Silas stood there, the lantern shaking in his hand. The rage that filled him was black and bottomless. They were killing innocent things just to hurt him, just to get to her. He felt a presence behind him. Clara stood in the barn door. She saw the slashed saddles. She saw the calf. She saw the words on the post. She did not scream. She did not cry. She went very still. Silas turned to her. "Go back to the house." She looked at the calf. "It is because of me," she said dulls. "It is because they are evil men," Silas said. "It is because I am here," she corrected. "They will destroy you. Silas, they will kill your stock. They will burn your roof. They will kill you." Silas walked over to her. "We will fight them. You cannot fight a fire with bare hands," she said. She turned and walked back to the house. Silas spent the rest of the night cleaning the barn, his heart heavy with a sense of impending doom. When he returned to the house at dawn, the kitchen was neat, the coffee was made, but the silence was different. He went to the back room. The door was open. The pallet was made up perfectly. Her few things were gone. On the pillow was a piece of brown wrapping paper. Silas picked it up. Her handwriting was elegant, a relic of the education she was never meant to use. "I will not be the fire that burns you down. Forgive me." Silas crumpled the paper in his fist. He looked out the window at the vast, empty range. She had run. She had gone back out into the wolves and the wind to save him. Silas Thorne grabbed his coat. He grabbed his rifle. He did not care about the ranch. He did not care about the cattle. He went to the barn and saddled Buster. He was not going to let her die. Not for him. Not for anyone. The dawn broke gray and silent, a bruised light bleeding over the eastern ridges. The ranch house was still, but the silence was wrong. It was not the peaceful quiet of sleep. It was the hollow, echoing emptiness of a place abandoned. Silas Thorne stood in the doorway of the back room, the piece of brown wrapping paper crushed in his fist. The room was cold. The pallet was smooth. She was gone. He did not waste time cursing. He moved with a mechanical, terrifying efficiency. He checked the load in his Winchester. He filled a canteen. He grabbed a handful of dried beef and shoved it into his pocket. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the world suspended in a damp, freezing stillness. The mud in the yard was semi-frozen, holding the crisp edges of footprints like a plaster cast. He found her trail leading west, away from the road, toward the broken country where the foothills rose into the jagged spine of the mountains. It was a foolish route. The terrain there was unforgiving, a maze of shale slides, thorny mesquite, and box canyons that could trap a traveler until they starved. But it was the only route that offered cover from eyes on the main road. Silas mounted Buster and set off. The land she had walked into was deceptive. From the porch, the mountains looked like a painted backdrop, close enough to touch. In reality, they were 20 miles of hellish ground away. The rolling breaks between the ranch and the timberline were deep scars in the earth, filled with shadows and sudden drops. Silas rode with his eyes glued to the ground. He read the story of her flight in the subtle disturbances of the land. Here, a boot heel had slipped on a mossy rock, leaving a scrape of fresh gray stone. There, a branch of sagebrush was snapped, the inner wood still green and moist. She was moving fast, he realized, driven by a desperation that overrode pain. As he tracked her, a cold panic began to uncoil in his gut. It was a sensation he had not felt in 12 years, not since the night he rode for the doctor while Sarah burned with fever in the bed behind him. It was the fear of time running out. He saw where she had fallen. The snow in a hollow was disturbed, the imprint of her hip and hand clear in the drift. She had lain there for a moment. He could see the melt where her body heat had seeped into the ice, before forcing herself up. "Get up, Clara," he whispered to the empty air. "Keep moving." He rode for 3 hours. The sun climbed higher, weak and watery behind the clouds. Then, the tracks changed. He came up a rise that overlooked the old wagon road leading into Granite Creek. Her footprints came down out of the rocks and intersected with the mud of the road. And there, the story turned violent. Silas pulled Buster up short. He looked at the churned earth. She had stepped onto the road, likely hoping to flag down a freight wagon or perhaps realizing the mountains were impassable without gear. But she had not found a wagon. Silas saw the deep, gouging hoofprints of 3 horses. They had come from the direction of town, moving at a gallop. They had circled her. He saw the scuff marks where she had tried to run, the deep indentations where she had been dragged. There was a man's boot print, a distinct tread with a heavy heel, overlying her small print. Silas felt the blood rush in his ears. It was a roaring sound, like a river in flood. They had her. He did not look for more sign. He knew where they had taken her. He kicked the roan into a run, the mud flying from the hooves as he thundered toward Granite Creek. The town was awake when Silas arrived. It was mid-morning, and the commerce of the day was in full swing. But as Silas rode down the main street, the activity seemed to stutter and stall. People stopped on the boardwalks. Faces appeared in windows. They watched the rancher ride past, and for once, there were no sneers. There was only a wary, hush-toned curiosity. They saw the rifle in his scabbard. They saw the look on his face, a look that promised ruin. Silas rode straight to the sheriff's office. He did not tie his horse. He swung down, leaving the reins trailing in the mud, and threw the door open. The office was warm, smelling of stale tobacco and coal smoke. Sheriff Brady was sitting at his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a penknife. Two deputies, Hayes and a new man Silas did not recognize, were leaning against the wall, drinking coffee. "Where is she?" Silas asked. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. Brady did not look up immediately. He finished cleaning his thumbnail, then folded the knife and placed it in his vest pocket. "Morning. Silas, you look like you rode hard. Where is she?" "Brady. She is in custody," Brady said calmly. "For her own protection, you understand. We found her wandering the road, distressed, a woman in her condition. She was a danger to herself." Silas took a step forward. The two deputies straightened, their hands drifting toward their belts. "She is not a danger," Silas said, "and she is not a criminal. Open that door." He pointed to the heavy oak door leading to the cell block. "I cannot do that," Brady said. "She is being processed. We are checking into some outstanding matters. It seems there are questions about property theft from her previous employment. She stole nothing," Silas said. "That is for the law to decide," Brady said, "and until it does, she stays here. Or—" the sheriff leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "Or she agrees to return to the Kingman estate. Mr. Kingman is a forgiving man. He has indicated that if she returns and resumes her duties, and keeps her mouth shut about her little adventure, he will decline to press charges. The debts will be forgiven. It was a trap. Silas saw it clearly. They would send her back to that house, and she would never be seen again. She would be swallowed by the velvet curtains and the thick walls, and Kingman would break her until there was nothing left. Silas looked at the deputies. He looked at Brady. He turned and walked out the door. Brady chuckled. "Smart man. Silas, go home." But Silas did not go home. He walked to the middle of the street. The mud was ankle-deep. He stood there, in the center of the town, and he raised his voice. It was a baritone roar that carried over the wind, bouncing off the false fronts of the stores and the steeple of the church. "Sheriff Brady!" The town stopped. The blacksmith lowered his hammer. The store clerks came to the doors. "Bring her out!" Silas shouted. The door to the jail opened, and Brady stepped out onto the boardwalk, looking annoyed. A crowd was beginning to form. Men from the saloon, women with shopping baskets, the idlers who sat on the benches. "Go home, Thorne," Brady warned. "You are disturbing the peace." "I am disturbing your corruption," Silas yelled. He turned to the crowd. He saw Mrs. Gable. He saw Henderson, the grocer. He saw Vance, Kingman's foreman, leaning against a hitching post with a toothpick in his mouth. "This man," Silas pointed a shaking finger at the sheriff, "is holding a woman against her will. He calls it law. I call it trafficking." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. "She is a thief," Vance shouted from the sidewalk. "She stole silver from the Kingman house. She stole nothing but her own life," Silas shot back. "She is a fallen woman." The voice came from the steps of the church. Reverend Miller stood there, clutching his Bible like a weapon. "She is a temptress who screams obscenities. We have all heard the stories. Mr. Thorne, you harbor sin in your house and call it charity." The crowd muttered in agreement. The shame was weaponized now. They were throwing the rumors like stones. Whore, sinner, thief. Silas stood in the mud. He felt the weight of their judgment. It pressed on him like the winter sky. But he did not flinch. He looked at the preacher. He looked at Vance. He looked at the town that had rejected him for years. "Let her be a sinner, then," Silas shouted. "Let her be a thief. I do not care." The silence that followed was absolute. "She is under my protection," Silas declared. His voice cracked with the force of it. "I claim her. Whatever debt you think she owes, put it on my tab. Whatever sin you think she carries, I will carry it for her. But she does not go back to that house." He turned back to Brady. "If you give her to Kingman, you do it over my dead body. And I promise you, Sheriff, I will not die alone." It was an outrage. It was a scandal. A rancher openly claiming a spoiled woman, defying the church and the law in the town square. From the edge of the crowd, a man watched. He was leaning against the wall of the hotel, smoking a thin cheroot. He wore a suit that was dusty from travel, and his eyes were sharp and intelligent behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He had a notebook in his hand. His name was Elias Reed. He was a newspaperman from St. Louis, heading to the coast, looking for stories. He had seen hangings, gold rushes, and range wars, but he had never seen a man stand in the mud and defy a whole town for a woman he wasn't married to. Reed snapped his notebook shut and pushed off the wall. He smelled a story, and, unlike the locals, he didn't give a damn about Jeremiah Kingman. Brady stared at Silas. He saw the hand hovering near the Colt on Silas's hip. He saw the look in the rancher's eyes, the look of a man who has passed the point of reason. Brady was a bully, and like all bullies, he calculated the odds. Gunplay in the street was messy. It brought federal marshals. It brought questions. "Bring her out," Brady muttered to Deputy Hayes. "Let him see her, before he does something stupid." Hayes went inside and dragged Clara out. She was handcuffed. Her dress was muddy, her hair wild. She looked terrified. But when she saw Silas standing in the street, mud-spattered, furious, and immovable, her expression broke. "Silas," she breathed. Silas walked to the boardwalk. He did not step up. He stayed in the street, looking up at her. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, not yet. I am not leaving," Silas said. "Silas, please," she whispered. "They will ruin you. They already have," Silas said, "and I do not care." Brady stepped between them. "All right, you have seen her. She is alive. Now, unless you have a court order, Thorne, she stays in custody until the magistrate rides in next week, or until she agrees to the deal. I want to speak to her," a voice said. Everyone turned. Elias Reed walked through the mud, his boots polished but dirty. He tipped his bowler hat to the sheriff. "And who might you be?" Brady asked. "Elias Reed, the St. Louis Dispatch." Reed produced a card. "I'm writing a series on the administration of justice in the territories." Reed lied smoothly. "I could not help but overhear this. Lively debate. It seems there is a question of due process here." Brady's eyes narrowed. "We do not need reporters here. The First Amendment applies even in the mud." "Sheriff," Reed said, "I would like to interview the prisoner, unless, of course, you have something to hide." Brady looked at the crowd. He looked at the notebook. He knew that print was dangerous. 5 minutes. Brady spat. "In the back office. Keep the door open." They moved into the small office behind the jail cells. It was cramped and smelled of lye soap. Silas stood by the door, refusing to sit. Clara sat on a wooden stool, her hands still cuffed in her lap. Elias Reed leaned against the desk, pencil poised. "Tell me the truth," Reed said softly. "Not the town gossip. The truth. Why is a powerful man like Kingman so afraid of a maid?" Clara looked at Silas. He nodded once. She turned to the reporter. "It is not just silver," she said. Her voice was steady now, fueled by the anger that had replaced her fear. "What is it?" Reed asked. "A ledger," Clara said. Silas looked at her. She had never mentioned a ledger. "He keeps 2 books," Clara explained. "One for the tax assessor and the railroad investors, and one for himself." The black ledger. It lists the bribes he pays to the Cattle Association. It lists the payments to the sheriff. She glanced at the open door where Brady stood out of earshot. And it lists the names of the homesteaders whose barns were burned. The dates. The prices paid to the men who lit the matches. Reed was writing furiously. "You saw this book?" "I dusted it for 3 years. Clara said, I know where he keeps it. Under the floorboard beneath the safe in his study. He thinks no one notices the servant girl. He thinks we are furniture. If that book exists," Reed said, looking up, "it would hang him. And the sheriff, that is why they want her back." Silas realized aloud. "It is not to punish her. It is to silence her." Clara looked at Silas. "I wanted to run to protect you, but if I run, they win." Reed closed his notebook. "Miss, if you can describe that book, dates, names, anything specific, I can telegraph the details to a federal marshal in Denver. I can bypass the local circuit, but we need time." "We do not have time," Silas said. "The sheriff will hand her over tonight as soon as the town goes to sleep. Then we make it impossible for him," Reed said. "We make so much noise he doesn't dare." Reed went out to the front room to distract the sheriff with bureaucratic questions. Silas and Clara were left alone for a moment in the small back room. The air was thick with the dust of the fight. Silas moved toward her. He reached out and touched the iron cuffs on her wrists. "I am sorry," he said. "I should have been faster." Clara stood up. She took a step toward him. She pressed her forehead against his chest. She did not cry. She simply breathed. She inhaled the scent of him. Tobacco, wet wool, horse, and the sharp, metallic smell of the gun oil. It was the smell of safety. Silas stood rigid. His hands hovered in the air near her shoulders. He wanted to wrap his arms around her, to crush her to him, to bury his face in her hair. But he remembered his promise. No one touches you. He did not claim what she did not explicitly offer. He let her take what she needed. "Why?" she whispered into his coat. Silas looked over her head at the barred window. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You could have stayed on the ranch. You could have let me go. Why stand in the mud and let them call you names?" Silas lowered his head until his cheek brushed her hair. "Because I want you alive," he said. "It was not a poem. It was a fact. Because when I saw your empty bed this morning, the world went gray again. Because I see you, Clara, not the scandal, not the maid. I see you." He swallowed hard. "And the thought of losing you, the thought of you back in that house, it makes me sick. I cannot breathe when I think of it." Clara pulled back. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, searching his face. She saw the raw, terrified honesty there. "Silas," she said softly. Before she could say more, the door banged open. Sheriff Brady filled the frame. "Time is up," Brady growled. He grabbed Clara's arm. Silas's hand shot out and gripped the sheriff's wrist. "Careful, Brady," Silas said. Brady yanked Clara back. "Get out, Thorne, before I throw you in the next cell." Silas was forced out into the street. Reed followed him. The sun was setting now. The town was quiet, but it was a tense, watching quiet. Vance, the foreman, walked up to Silas. He was flanked by 2 ranch hands. "Thorne," Vance said. Silas turned. His hand rested on his gun. "The boss has an offer," Vance said. "He is a reasonable man. He knows you are. Emotional." "State it," Silas said. "Walk away." Vance said, "Go back to your ranch. Forget the girl. If you do, the lease on the north pasture is renewed for 10 years. Dirt cheap. And the sheriff forgets about the scene you caused today. And if I don't," Vance shrugged, "then the lease is canceled tomorrow. Your water rights will be challenged in court, and the sheriff will charge you with harboring a fugitive and obstructing justice. You will lose the land, the herd, and the house. You will be a pauper." "Silas, breaking rocks in the county prison." Vance smiled. "Is she worth it? A used-up girl? Is she worth your grandfather's land?" Silas looked at the ranch house in his mind. He saw the work of 40 years. He saw the grave of his wife on the hill. Then he saw Clara in the calving shed, holding the lantern. He saw her kneading dough with bruised hands. He saw the way she had pressed her forehead to his chest. Silas looked at Vance. Get off my path. Vance! Vance's smile vanished. You are making a mistake. Silas stepped closer, until he was nose to nose with the foreman. You tell Kingman that I am not selling, and tell him that if he wants her, he has to come through me, and tell him to bring more men. He shouldered past Vance and walked toward the livery stable. Reed caught up to him. That was brave, Reed said, or foolish. Silas tightened the cinch on his saddle. She knows about the ledger. Silas said, that is the key. Reed nodded. Yes, but getting that ledger, that is a suicide mission. Silas swung into the saddle. He looked down at the newspaperman. It is not suicide. Mr. Reed, it is war. He rode out of town, not toward his ranch, but toward the high ridge that overlooked the valley. He needed to watch. He needed to plan. Love. He realized, as the cold wind hit his face, was not the soft thing the poets wrote about. It was not flowers and whispers. Love was a drawn gun. Love was a line in the mud. Love was looking at the destruction of your entire life and choosing it, because the alternative was a world without her. He settled in to wait for the dark. The summer arrived like a hammer blow. The gentle green of spring was scorched away by a relentless sun that hung in a cloudless, iron blue sky. The wind shifted, blowing hot and dry from the south, carrying the taste of dust and sage. The creek that fed the Double Bar Ranch began to fail. It was not just the drought. It was theft. Upstream, on the vast Kingman holding, men were diverting the flow, damming the water to soak their own hay meadows while the downstream ranches withered. Silas Thorne watched his grass turn brittle and yellow. He spent his days in the saddle, moving his shrinking herd to the high timber where the springs still wept a little water from the earth. Clara rode with him. She wore a split riding skirt Silas had cut down from an old pair of trousers and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. She was no longer the pale invalid who had fainted in the snow. The sun had browned her skin, and the hard labor had put muscle on her frame. She rode with a grim determination, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, not for cattle, but for riders. They were under siege. The town of Granite Creek had turned its back on them completely. Merchants demanded cash up front. The blacksmith claimed he was too busy to shoe Silas's horses. When they rode past the church, heads turned away, and doors were shut with pointed firmness. But they had a weapon. Elias Reed, the newspaperman, had not left. He had set up a temporary office in the back of the livery stable, ignoring the sheriff's glares. He was digging. One evening, Reed rode out to the ranch. He looked out of place in his dusty city suit, wiping sweat from his spectacles. I found him, Reed said, accepting a tin cup of lukewarm water. Found who? Silas asked. The man who knows about the fire at the Melodic Homestead 3 years ago, Reed said. His name is Jim Calloway. He used to ride for Kingman. He was fired for drinking, but he saw who lit the match. Will he talk? Clara asked. She was standing by the stove, her hand resting on the back of Silas's chair. He is scared, Reed admitted, but he is more angry than scared. Kingman withheld his wages. I bought him a bottle and promised him protection. He signed a statement. Reed pulled a folded paper from his pocket. This ties Kingman's foreman, Vance, to the arson, Reed said. And if Vance did it, he did it on orders. It is a start. We just need the ledger to close the noose. Silas looked at the paper. It felt light, but it carried the weight of a death sentence if Kingman found out. We need to get this to the federal marshal in Denver, Silas said. Reed nodded. Judge Holloway is riding the circuit. He is due in Granite Creek in 2 days. He is not a federal marshal, but he has the power to convene a grand jury. If we present this along with Clara's testimony about the ledger, he can issue a federal warrant. It was a gamble. Holloway was the same judge who had warned Silas about the thin shield of the law, but he was their only chance before the water ran out completely. The next day, they went to town to file the motion for a hearing. The heat in town was suffocating. Dust hung in the air, coating the boardwalks. Silas went to the courthouse with Reed. Clara waited at the general store to buy supplies. It was a risk, but she refused to hide in the wagon. Inside the store, the air was cool and smelled of spices and dry goods. Misses. Gable and 2 other women from the church were there, inspecting bolts of calico. When Clara walked in, the conversation died instantly. "Mrs." Gable turned, her face pinching into a mask of righteous disapproval. "I'm surprised you show your face here," she said, her voice loud enough to carry to the street. "After the shame you have brought to this valley." Clara stopped. She placed her basket on the counter. She looked at the women. For months, she had looked down. She had hidden. She had let Silas speak for her. Today, she was tired. "My face is not the one that should be hidden," Clara said evenly. "Mrs." Gable gasped. "You speak to me? You, who lives in sin with a man not your husband? You, who ran from a decent Christian home?" "Decent?" Clara asked. She took a step forward. The women shrank back, clutching their skirts as if Clara's touch might stain them. "Is it decent to beat a woman until she bleeds?" Clara asked, her voice rising. "Is it decent to lock her in a room and use her like a rag?" She looked at Mrs. "Gable, you know," she said. "You all know. You see the bruises on the maids. You hear the stories, but you pretend it is piety to look away. You trade your silence for your husband's credit at the bank. How dare you, Mrs. Gable sputtered. "I survived," Clara said. "I crawled through the snow to save my own life. If you were in that house, Mrs. Gable, if the door was locked and the footsteps were coming down the hall, would you have been strong enough to run? Or would you have stayed and let him kill your soul just to keep your reputation clean?" The store was deadly silent. "Mrs." Gable opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Clara, and for a second, the certainty in her eyes wavered. She saw not a whore, but a woman standing tall in the wreckage of a life they had helped destroy. Clara picked up her basket. "I buy my flour with coin, same as you," she said to the stunned shopkeeper. "Weigh it." That night, back at the ranch, the tension that had been coiling tight for months finally snapped, not into violence, but into something else. The heat had not broken with the sunset. The cabin was sweltering. Silas stood on the porch, watching the dark ridgeline, the rifle leaning against the rail. Clara came out. She was wearing her nightdress, a simple white cotton shift, her hair loose down her back. "They will not come tonight," she said softly. "They know the judge is in town. They will wait." Silas turned to look at her. The moonlight washed out the colors, turning the world to silver and shadow. She looked ethereal, but her eyes were dark and solid. "You were brave today," Silas said. "Reed told me what you said to the hens." "I am done being afraid of them," Clara said. She moved closer to him. The air between them was heavy, charged with the summer heat and the adrenaline of the fight. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. He saw the pulse beating in her throat. "We might lose this," she said. "The judge might rule against us. Vance might burn us out. I won't let that happen," Silas vowed. "You cannot promise that," she said. "You can fight, but you cannot control the world." She reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused from 40 years of rope and wire. Her skin was soft, but strong. "If this is all we have," she whispered, "if this is the only time, I do not want to spend it standing on opposite sides of a room." Silas felt his breath hitch. He looked at her, really looked at her, stripping away the layers of duty and protection. He saw the woman who had stitched up his hand, the woman who had pulled the calf in the mud, the woman who made him feel alive for the first time since Sarah died. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "I am not asking for payment." "Silas," she said, echoing his own words from months ago. "I am choosing." She stepped into him. Silas dropped the pretext of distance. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. It was not a collision. It was a homecoming. He kissed her. It was a desperate, hungry thing, tasting of salt and dust. They moved inside, away from the open grandeur of the night, seeking the shadows of the room that had been his solitary confinement and was now their sanctuary. There was no shame in it. There was no hesitation. In the dark, with the rifle by the bed and the world against them, They held on to each other with a trembling honesty. It was an act of defiance. It was an assertion that they were alive, that they belonged to themselves and to each other, and that no judge or cattle baron could take this moment away. The consequences of their defiance arrived with the morning sun. Silas was in the corral when he smelled the smoke. It was not the wood smoke of a chimney. It was the acrid, oily smell of burning hay. He spun around. A column of black smoke was rising from the stackyard, a quarter-mile from the house where he stored his winter feed. "Fire!" he shouted. Clara ran from the house, grabbing wet sacks. They raced toward the stackyard. As they ran, Silas saw the cause. A glass kerosene bottle lay shattered near the fence. The hay was a wall of flame, roaring in the dry wind. If it spread to the barn, they would lose everything. "Get the horses out," Silas yelled. He charged the fire, beating at the edges with the wet sack, choking on the smoke. The heat was blistering, singing his eyebrows. Then the ground shook. Through the smoke, Silas saw a nightmare. His herd, spooked by the fire and likely driven by riders he couldn't see in the haze, was stampeding. 50 head of cattle were thundering down the draw, heading straight for the garden and the house. "Clara!" Silas screamed. Clara was near the garden fence. She froze. The noise was deafening, a rolling thunder of hooves. She looked at the oncoming wall of muscle and horn. The trauma of the past, the feeling of being trapped, slammed into her. Her breath seized. She could not move. The panic held her rooted to the spot. Silas abandoned the fire. He sprinted, throwing himself over the garden fence. He tackled Clara, driving her to the ground and rolling them both under the heavy timber of the bottom rail, just as the herd smashed through the upper fence. Dust and hooves filled the world. The ground hammered against their bodies. Silas covered her with his own body, shielding her head with his arms, whispering a steady stream of curses and prayers into her ear. "Stay down. I have got you. Breathe. Just breathe." The herd passed, tearing the garden to shreds, trampling the vegetables into paste, and thundering on down the valley. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of the burning hay. Silas pulled back. Clara was shaking violently, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was gasping for air. "Clara," Silas said. His voice was low, commanding but gentle. "Look at me." She stared at the sky. "Clara, here, now." He took her face in his hands. He forced her to look at his eyes. "You are safe. The cows are gone. I am here." He grounded her, using his weight and his voice to pull her back from the ledge of her panic. He proved in that moment that his touch was a shield, not a weapon. She blinked, and the recognition flooded back. She grabbed his shirt, sobbing once, hard. They burned the hay. She choked out. Silas helped her up. He looked at the smoldering ruin of his winter feed. He looked at the destroyed garden. "Yes," he said grimly, "they are trying to starve us out, but the violence was not done." That evening, Elias Reed rode into the yard. His horse was lathered. His face was gray. "What is it?" Silas asked, meeting him at the gate. Reed slid from the saddle. He looked sick. "Jim Calloway," Reed said. "The witness. What about him? They found him an hour ago, in the alley behind the saloon. Dead?" Reed nodded. "Throat cut. And they found a knife near the body." Silas felt the cold dread settle in his stomach. Whose knife? Reed looked at Clara. Who had come out to the porch? "It was a paring knife," Reed said softly. "With a white bone handle. The sheriff says. He says it looks like a woman's knife." Clara put a hand to her mouth. "I lost a knife like that. Weeks ago. In the pasture. They planted it. Silas said, 'Sheriff Brady is gathering a posse.'" Reed said, urgency in his voice. "He has a warrant for Clara. Murder. They are pinning it on her," Clara whispered. "They want you in custody before the judge opens court tomorrow," Reed said. "If you are a murder suspect, your testimony about the ledger is inadmissible. They discredit you, they hang you, and Kingman walks free." "Get in the wagon," Silas ordered. "Where are we going?" Clara asked. "We are not waiting for them to come here," Silas said. "We are going to the judge. Tonight." They drove the wagon hard through the darkness, taking the back trails to avoid the main road. They arrived in Granite Creek just before midnight, instead of the jail. Silas drove straight to the hotel where Judge Holloway was staying. He hammered on the door of the judge's room. Holloway opened it, wearing a nightshirt, a pistol in his hand. "Thorne, are you drunk? I am bringing you a witness," Silas said, pushing past him into the room. "Pulling Clara with him, before the sheriff kills her." Holloway looked at them, dusty, smelling of smoke, desperation radiating off them. "Sheriff Brady has a warrant for her arrest for the murder of Jim Calloway," Silas said. "It is a frame-up. Calloway was our witness against Kingman." Holloway sat on the bed, rubbing his face. "You are making a mess of my circuit." "Thorne, I am trying to save a life," Silas said. "Take her into federal custody. Now." "If she is your prisoner, the sheriff cannot touch her." Holloway looked at Clara. She stood tall, despite the fear. "I did not kill that man. Judge," she said, "I have never killed anything." Holloway sighed. He poured a glass of water. "Very well. You are under the protection of the United States Court, but you better have a hell of a story for the morning, young woman, because the town is going to be baying for blood." The hearing the next morning was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed. The air was stiflingly hot. Sheriff Brady stood by the door, his face like thunder, furious that his prize had been snatched. Jeremiah Kingman sat in the front row, a man of 50 with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Silas's ranch. He looked bored. Clara took the stand. She had no lawyer. Reed sat with Silas at the defense table, the Kingman estate lawyer. A sharp-faced man named Mr. Blight began the questioning. He did not ask about the ledger. He asked about her morals. "Is it true you lived in sin with the defendant?" Blight asked. "I lived in his house," Clara said. "Is it true you screamed obscenities at him? That you are known to be hysterical?" "I was in pain," Clara said. "Is it true you stole silver from Mr. Kingman?" "No, Mr." Blight leaned in. "Is it true that you seduced Mr. Kingman, and when he rejected your advances, you invented these lies about ledgers and abuse to blackmail him?" The room buzzed. The humiliation was a physical weight. Clara gripped the rail of the witness stand. Her hands shook. She felt the eyes of the town. Mrs. Gable, the men from the saloon, stripping her bare. She looked at Silas. He was sitting perfectly still. He nodded. "Just a fraction. I see you." Clara took a breath. "I did not seduce him," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I was his property." Or so he thought. She looked directly at Kingman. "He keeps a ledger," she said, "under the floorboard of the safe. It is black leather. It records the payments to Sheriff Brady. It records the payment of $50 to the men who burned the melodic barn. And it records the dates he came to my room." Kingman did not move, but his eyes narrowed. "Lies!" Blight shouted. "If they are lies," Clara said, "lift the floorboard." Judge Holloway banged his gavel. "Order." Silas watched Kingman. He saw the Baron's signal to Vance near the back of the room. Vance slipped out. Silas tapped Reed. "Something is happening." The judge called a recess until the afternoon to allow the marshal to inspect the Kingman safe. It was a victory, but a fragile one. As they walked out of the courthouse, the crowd pressed in. Silas kept a hand on Clara's back. "We need to get you to safety until the marshal returns," Silas said. They moved toward the hotel. Suddenly, a wagon clattered down the street, moving too fast. The driver was masked. "Look out!" Silas yelled. He shoved Clara toward the boardwalk, but the wagon swerved, cutting her off. Two men jumped from the back. It was not an accident. It was a snatch. They grabbed Clara. She screamed, fighting, clawing at their faces. Silas drew his gun, but the street was too crowded. He couldn't fire without hitting a bystander. "Let her go!" Silas roared, charging the wagon. One of the men swung a club. It caught Silas on the temple. The world exploded in white light. Silas went down to his knees, blood blinding him. He saw the men throw Clara into the back of the wagon. He saw her terrified face as she reached for him. "Silas!" The wagon tore off, dust flying, heading south out of town, toward the Badlands. Silas fought the darkness threatening to swallow him. He tried to stand, stumbling. Reed was there, holding him up. "Silas, you are hurt!" Silas wiped the blood from his eyes. He looked at the disappearing dust cloud. "They took her," Silas rasped. He shoved Reed away. He staggered toward the hitching rail where Buster was tied. "They are going to kill her," Silas said, "before the marshal gets to that safe." He pulled himself into the saddle, swaying. The pain in his head was a jagged spike, but the rage was stronger. "Go to the marshal," Silas told Reed. "Tell him to open that safe." "What are you going to do?" Reed shouted. Silas spurred the horse, turning him toward the south. "I am going to finish it." The wagon tracks ended at the edge of the Devil's Anvil, a stretch of badlands where the earth had collapsed into a chaotic jumble of shale slides, sandstone pillars, and dry washes that twisted like snakes in agony. The wind here did not just blow, it screamed, tearing over the knife-edged ridges with a sound like tearing canvas. Silas Thorne pulled his horse up. His head was throbbing with a sickening rhythmic pulse where the club had struck him. Blood had dried in a crust down the side of his neck, stiffening his collar. He slid from the saddle, his boots skidding on the loose rock. The wagon was abandoned, its axle broken on a hidden boulder. They had switched to horses. Silas knelt, examining the ground. The wind was scrubbing the sign away fast, but he saw the scuff of a boot, small, dragged against its will. They were moving deeper into the Badlands, toward the high timber line where a man could disappear forever. Silas checked his Winchester. He had 5 rounds left. He checked his belt gun. 6. He did not feel fear. He felt a cold, crystalline clarity. The part of him that was a rancher, a neighbor, a man of peace, had been left back in the dust of the town street. What remained was the man who had buried a wife and child and had sworn never to stand at a graveside again. He mounted and spurred the roan into the labyrinth. 2 miles up the wash, the canyon narrowed. The walls rose high and sheer, blocking out the sun. The air turned biting cold as the elevation climbed. Silas heard the echo of a horseshoe striking stone. He dismounted and tied Buster to a scrub cedar. He moved forward on foot, climbing a shale slope that crumbled silently under his weight. He crested the ridge and looked down. They were there, in a small bowl of rock, sheltered from the worst of the wind. 3 men had stopped. 2 were the hired muscle from the wagon. The 3rd man, pacing nervously near a shivering horse, was Jeremiah Kingman. He had ridden ahead to meet them, to ensure the job was done before the law could catch up. Clara was on her knees in the dirt. Her hands were bound behind her back. She was not crying. Her head was up, watching Kingman with a look of terrifying stillness. Silas lay prone on the ridge, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. The distance was 200 yards. The wind was crosswise, gusting hard. A difficult shot. He watched through the sights. Kingman was shouting at the men. He pointed a gloved hand at Clara, then at the deep ravine that dropped away to the north. "Do it!" Kingman's voice drifted up, thin and reedy in the wind. "Do it now and throw her over." The big man, Vance's second in command, stepped toward Clara, drawing a knife. Silas did not hesitate. He adjusted for the wind and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The knife spun out of the man's hand, shattered by the heavy lead slug. The man howled, clutching his numbed fingers. Silas levered the action. The second shot kicked up dirt at Kingman's feet. "Cover!" Kingman screamed. Scrambling behind a boulder, the 2 hired men dove for the rocks. Pulling their pistols, they began to fire blindly up at the ridge, their bullets whining off the stone near Silas's head. Silas ducked, feeling stone chips spray his cheek. He was pinned. He could not move down to her without exposing himself to a fusillade of lead. Clara was alone in the open, midway between the men and the drop. Kingman peered out from his rock. He saw Silas was suppressed. He looked at Clara. He realized he had a hostage. "Get her up," Kingman barked at the man with the injured hand. "Use her as a shield." The man lunged for Clara, but Clara did not recoil. She did not scramble away. She saw Kingman's face, sweaty, pale, his eyes darting with the panic of a man whose power was stripping away. She saw the vanity that had always been his armor. She twisted her body, kicking out with her heavy riding boots. She caught the hired man in the knee, sending him stumbling. Then she turned her gaze on Kingman. "You are afraid." "Jeremiah," she shouted. The wind caught her voice and amplified it. "Shut up," Kingman yelled. "You are afraid because the ledger is gone," she taunted, standing up, swaying with her hands bound. "You think killing me stops it? The judge is opening your safe right now." Kingman's face twisted. "You are lying. Why are you here?" Clara pressed, walking toward him, forcing the hired men to hold their fire lest they hit their boss. "You are here because you know it is over. You are not a king anymore. You are just a thief in a suit." She was using his greatest fear, humiliation, to freeze him. She knew he could not stand to be seen as small. Kingman stepped out from the rock, his face purple with rage. He raised his own pistol, leveling it at her chest. "I made you," he screamed. "I can unmake you." Clara looked down the barrel. She did not blink. "You never made me," she said softly. "You only stole from me, and now you have nothing left to steal." Kingman's hand wavered. For a split second, the doubt paralyzed him. That second was all Silas needed. He broke cover, sliding down the shale slope, abandoning the rifle for the Colt in his hand. It was a reckless, suicidal charge, skidding down the loose rock in a cloud of dust. The hired men turned to fire at him. Silas fired on the run. His first shot took the man with the injured hand in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second man, the driver of the wagon, took careful aim at Silas. Silas saw the muzzle flash. He felt the wind of the bullet pass his ear. He stopped his slide, digging his heels in, steadying his gun hand with his left. The world narrowed down to the front sight and the man's chest. It was raw and ugly. It was not the smooth duel of a dime novel. It was shaking hands and breath tearing in the thin air. Silas fired. The driver crumpled, hit in the chest. Kingman turned, his pistol still pointed at Clara. He looked at his fallen men. He looked at Silas, who was now 30 yards away, bloody and terrible. Kingman panicked. He swung the gun toward Silas. Clara threw herself at Kingman's legs. She slammed into him, knocking him off balance. The gun went off, the bullet plowing into the dirt. Kingman fell hard, flailing. He kicked Clara away, scrambling backward toward the edge of the ravine. Silas was on him in 3 strides. He did not shoot. He holstered his gun and grabbed Kingman by the lapels of his expensive coat. He hauled the cattle baron to his feet and slammed him against the rock face. Kingman was gasping, his eyes bulging. "Don't! I'll pay you! I'll give you the deed, anything!" Silas held him there. His knuckles were white. The rage in him was a roaring furnace. He wanted to throw this man over the edge. He wanted to crush the life out of him for every bruise he had put on Clara, for every day of fear he had caused. He put his forearm against Kingman's throat, pressing until the man turned red. Silas looked into Kingman's eyes and saw nothing but rot. "Do it!" a voice in his head whispered. "No one will know." He slipped. Silas felt the weight of his soul in the balance. If he killed this man in anger, he became him. He became just another brute solving problems with violence. He looked over his shoulder. Clara was sitting in the dust. She had struggled to her knees. She was watching him. She did not shout, "Kill him." She did not shout, "Stop." She simply watched, trusting him to choose who he was. Silas let out a shuddering breath. He pulled Kingman away from the rock and threw him to the ground. "You are not worth the bullet," Silas rasped. He turned his back on Kingman and walked to Clara. He pulled his knife and cut the ropes binding her wrists. As the ropes fell away, Clara reached for him. She buried her face in his coat, shaking. Silas held her, his hand tangling in her wind-whipped hair. Behind them, the sound of hooves thundered up the canyon. Silas spun around, hand on his gun, but it was not more hired guns. It was a posse. Sheriff Brady rode in the lead, but he was not in command. Beside him rode a man with a silver star on his coat, a U.S. Marshal, and behind them was Elias Reed. The marshal swung down, his shotgun leveled at Kingman, who was trying to crawl toward his horse. "Jeremiah Kingman!" the marshal shouted. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, arson, and federal corruption." Kingman looked at Brady. "Sheriff, do something!" Brady looked at the marshal. He looked at the ledger the marshal's deputy was holding, the black book Reed had helped them find in the safe. "I can't help you, Mr. Kingman," Brady said, his voice flat. "It seems your books don't balance." The deputy swarmed Kingman, cuffing his hands behind his back. The arrogance finally broke, leaving a sobbing, pathetic old man in the dust. Reed walked up to Silas and Clara. He looked at the bodies of the hired men. He looked at the blood on Silas's face. "I see you found them," Reed said quietly. Silas holstered his gun. "We survived them," he corrected. The ride back to town was slow. The adrenaline faded, leaving pain and exhaustion in its wake. When they entered Granite Creek, it was late afternoon. The sun was casting long, golden shadows across the street. The town had changed. News of the ledger, of the arrest, and of the marshal's presence had swept through the valley like a brush fire. The structure of power that had held the town in fear for 20 years had collapsed in a single afternoon. People stood on the boardwalks as the marshal led Kingman toward the jail, the same jail where Clara had been held. They watched Silas and Clara ride behind. There were no jeers this time, no stones, but there were no cheers either. Silas saw Mrs. Gable standing outside the dry goods store. She watched Clara ride past. Her face was not angry anymore, but it was not kind. It was closed, guarded. She looked away, unable to meet the eyes of the woman she had condemned. Silas realized the truth then. The law could punish crimes, but it could not cure the rot in people's hearts. The town knew they had been wrong, but they would never forgive Clara for forcing them to see it. Prejudice did not vanish. It simply retreated into the shadows. Some faces in the crowd softened. The blacksmith tipped his hat. A young woman waved tentatively, but others hardened, resenting the mirror that had been held up to their hypocrisy. They stopped at the livery stable. Silas helped Clara down. She winced, her wrists raw from the ropes. Reed came up to them. "The marshal wants a statement," Reed said, "but it can wait until morning." "You are cleared. Clara, the charges against you are dropped. The charges against Kingman will put him away for the rest of his life." "Thank you." "Elias," Clara said. Reed tipped his hat. "I just wrote the story. Ma'am, you lived it." He walked away, leaving them alone in the quiet of the stable. Silas led the horses into their stalls. He worked mechanically, removing the saddles, brushing the sweat from their coats. The simple, routine tasks grounded him. Clara sat on a bale of hay, watching him. When he was done, Silas stood by the open door, looking out at the darkening street. The town was quieting down. Lamps were being lit. "It is over," Silas said. "Is it?" Clara asked. Silas turned to her. "Legally, yes, you are free. No one will hunt you." He walked over to her. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair. He looked tired, older than his years, but his eyes were clear. He did not assume. He did not claim. He offered. "You have a choice now, Clara," he said. She looked at him. "You are a free woman. You can take the stagecoach tomorrow. You can go to Denver or San Francisco. Start over where no one knows your name, where no one looks at you and remembers the scandal." He paused, his voice dropping. "I will sell enough stock to give you a start. You will not go empty-handed." Clara stood up. She walked to him, stopping a foot away. "And the other choice?" she asked. Silas looked at her. "Or you can come back to the ranch. With me." He gestured vaguely toward the town. "It will not be easy. They will talk. They will always talk. We will be the outsiders. The rancher and the fallen woman. We will have to fight for every scrap of respect we get." He looked down at his hands. "I am not a soft man. Clara, I have scars. I have ghosts. I cannot give you a society life." Clara reached out and took his hand. She ran her thumb over the white line of the barbed wire scar. "I do not want a soft life." "Silas," she said. Her voice was trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer magnitude of the truth she was speaking. I ran from a soft life because it was a cage. I do not want to be rescued anymore. And I do not want permission to exist. She squeezed his hand. I want a partner, she said. I want to build something that is real, even if it is hard, even if it costs us comfort. She looked into his eyes. I am not leaving, Silas, unless you tell me to go. Silas let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 12 years. The wall around his heart, the one he had built stone by stone after Sarah died, crumbled into dust. He did not pull her into a crush of passion. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of reverence that was louder than any shout. Then let them talk, Silas said. We will give them something to talk about. They did not stay in town that night. They saddled the horses fresh. They rode out under the cover of the stars, leaving the lights of Granite Creek behind them. They rode west toward the ranch. The night air was cool and clean, scrubbing the dust of the Badlands from their lungs. As they crested the final rise, the ranch house came into view. It was dark, silent, and small against the vast backdrop of the mountains. The barn still smelled faintly of smoke. The garden was trampled. The winter would be hard without the hay, but as Silas looked at it, he did not see ruin. He saw a beginning. He looked at Clara riding beside him. She sat tall in the saddle, her silhouette framed against the Milky Way. She was no longer the broken thing he had pulled from the snow. She was iron and wildflowers. She turned and caught his eye. She smiled. They rode down the hill together, side by side. They were two scarred people in a harsh land, facing an uncertain future with enemies behind them and work ahead of them. But as they crossed the threshold of their land, the wind seemed to drop, and the silence of the high country welcomed them home. They were no longer alone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the snow, the mud, and the fire, and I hope you felt every moment of Silas and Clara's fight for survival and love. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in the city, the country, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit and romance from the American frontier, please subscribe to the From Wild West channel. And finally, share your thoughts in English in the comments section. Did Silas make the right choice on the cliff? Would you have stayed in the town? I read every comment and love hearing your perspective. Until next time, keep your powder dry.